The Second Millennium, better known as the Imperial Collapse. The beginning of the Second Millennium IC heralded the decay in the once grand fortunes of the Empire. It is now known in Imperial history as a time of hedonistic excess, poor leadership, and civil strife. The Drakvald Elector Counts had become the emperors not long before, bribing their way into the office to use its power to preserve their province's failing position. The defeat at the hands of the Wood Elves and a series of disasters had weakened the province so much that there was fear that it would simply be absorbed by one of the others. The Drakvald Emperors moved the imperial capital to the city of Audiobook and began a reign so corrupt that the term Drakvalder to this day is a byword for a greedy, grasping person in the Empire. Under the Drakvalder's dubious leadership, the Empire would begin to rot away from within. For over a century, emperor after emperor continued the venal ways of the Drakvalder line, looking for any way to enrich themselves and caring more for their pleasures than the prosperity or well-being of the empire they ruled. Fragmentary annals of this time give lurid hints of the debaucheries and orgies held at the imperial court in Audiobook, and of others, even more obscene events. Two events of note took place in the 11th century IC, both during the reign of Emperor Ludwig II Hohenbach, known as Der Große on his coins, but better remembered by history as Ludwig the Fat. Both a gourmand and an avid hedonist, Ludwig was infamous for the torture and execution of chefs who offended his culinary tastes. Finally, he ordered his halfling valet to create a meal worthy of his greatness. The resulting butter-laden feast was so successful that Ludwig not only made his valet the imperial chef, but elevated him to the rank of Elector Count, tearing the fertile farmlands of the halflings away from Sturland and Averland to create the new great province of the Mootland. This appealed to Ludwig II not only because he had enjoyed a fine meal, but it also gave him political vengeance against the Elector Counts of those two states, whose daughters had spurned his greasy attentions. Seeing the success of these tactics, the cult of Sigmar began to slowly woo the grotesquely fat emperor. Invited to a ceaseless round of feasts, banquets, and private suppers, the emperor slowly began to see the cult in a positive light. Folk began to whisper that the Grand Theogenist of Sigmar would sit at Ludwig II's right hand, constantly filling his plate with fine food and his cup with wine. The cult of Sigmar gifted the emperor with a new palace in Altdorf, rumored to be fitted out with extensive kitchens, dining halls, and exceedingly luxurious privies. Eventually, the emperor signed a charter granting the Grand Theogenist of the cult of Sigmar an electoral vote in imperial elections. The Grand Theogenist of the time is said to have died in bed a short while later, smothered to death by his own neck fat. With the rise of the Drakvald line of emperors, the arts saw an explosion of noble patronage. In their quest for self-aggrandizement, the decadent imperial rulers commissioned flattering portraiture, fawning literature, and pompous self-promoting musical scores. The imperial nobility followed suit, and soon every one of any note had artists of one kind or another in their service. Referred to by imperial art historians as the naturalistic movement, the artwork of this period ceased to be a literal record of history as it was. Many noble families seized the chance to have their history recorded in huge tomes. Outrageous claims, tall battlefield tales, and simpering portrayals of forefathers became the norm for such books, leading to some extraordinary and somewhat amusing cases of one-upmanship. Similarly, many nobles chose to have favorable portraits created. Thus, for example, the infamous drooling Duke of Leichburg is depicted as a striking, martially capable man, with not one trace of his humpback and an entirely normal number of eyes. Some nobles went so far as to have their faces painted or woven into famous scenes from imperial history, such as its founding during the Battle of Blackfire Pass. Dismissed by the common folk as utter nonsense, this flowering of the arts saw some improvements for their lot in life as well. The cult of Sigmar was one of the first to seize upon the idea of illuminated books, commissioning lavish tomes after the style of the nobles' histories, focused around the life of Sigmar. These works were frequently treated as objects of homage, with some Sigmarite temples dedicating thousands of gold crowns to their creation. The completion of the soaring Cathedral of Sigmar in Altdorf occasioned the commissioning of 8 such illuminated books, each bound in beaten gold dug from the mountains by the descendants of King Kurgan Ironbeard himself. Completed in 1012 IC, these 8 tomes were paraded with great ceremony throughout the empire before being returned to a vault deep beneath the cathedral. Within the dye trade, the creation of so many works of art caused great leaps forward in coloring and dye fixatives. Not only were tinted inks in great demand, so too were fine shades of cloth and paint. Certain families began to specialize in the hugely expensive pigments required for noble portraiture, experimenting with all manner of ingredients in the quest to find the brightest blue and the most brilliant gold. This short-lived but highly lucrative trade reached its peak in 1023 IC, when Baroness Auerbach of Hochland was reputed to have paid 120,000 crowns for a pearl-based paint that exactly matched the yellow-white of her teeth. This brief blossoming of the arts was not to survive for long. The disasters to come would end the decadence of the Drakvald line for good. The year 1053 IC saw the accession of the last and worst of the Drakvald emperors, Boris Hohenbach, known forever to posterity as Boris Goldgather and Boris the Incompetent. Devoted solely to money and its acquisition, he let the elector counts rule as they wished, as long as he received the appropriate gifts. New titles and imperial offices were invented and sold, So now, elector counts vied with each other to acquire ever more grandiose titles, such as Grand Prince or Grand Duchess Palatine. A quick bribe would see a troublesome free town's charter revoked by the Emperor, the first news of which would come when the soldiers of the local nobleman would seize control and hang the Burgermeister. Others joined the game as the cults began selling ecclesiastical offices to the highest bidders. The Emperor himself would even sell to commoners the right to spend the night in the Imperial Palace, renting out the chambers of the 9th century Emperor Jurgen the Opulent. The Skaven Wars, from 1111 to 1115 IC. Judgment for these practices came in 1111 IC, when plague erupted in several cities at once in the east, spreading inexorably westwards. The easternmost lands of Talabakland and Ostland, which would later become the Kingdom of Kislev, were denuded of even animal life by the virulent disease and had to be abandoned by the Empire. The crowded imperial towns and cities were the hardest hit, and desperate authorities would set fires to burn whole neighborhoods at the first sign of the plague's emergence. Travelers even suspected of carrying the plague were hung and their corpses burned by desperate road wardens. Prayers to the gods went unanswered, with the priests dying at their altars, while the nobles and the wealthy commoners abandoned the urban areas for the relative safety of their rural manors and estates. The Emperor could not have cared less. Boris secluded himself at a palace, miles from Karabog, and allowed only the wealthiest and most beautiful of his subjects to join him there. Thoughts of plague and postulated peasants were far away. They would laugh and drink and wait for the plague to finally extinguish itself. In the summer of 1115 IC, there was an especially virulent eruption of the plague. The Emperor, most of the elector counts, and their immediate families and retainers had gathered at the Karabog Palace to hold court and wait for the disease to die down once more. One hot summer evening during a ball, they met their own deaths. As the Emperor gorged himself on roast goose and the courtiers danced under the stars, none noticed the figures in ragged robes gathering upwind of them. They were the censer carriers of Clan Pestilence, and this marked the beginning of the Skaven's first assault upon the Empire that was completely ignorant of the mutant rat men's existence. The winds carried the many chemical plagues of the Skaven throughout the palace grounds. Hundreds of the Empire's leaders died that night, buboes sprouting from their bodies and pustules bursting. As he lay dying, Emperor Boris the Incompetent listened as the Skaven leader told him of the rat men's grand plan. How armies of his kin were that very night marching all over the Empire, the heralds of mankind's downfall, the start of the great Skaven Wars. Many imperial towns and cities fell to the Skaven that night, and for the many that followed as the Skaven Wars erupted all around them. Even if they were not captured outright, the damage done to the Empire's infrastructure was tremendous, as libraries, temples, universities, and whole city districts burned. The Empire's defenders tried to put up a resistance, but they were disorganized and possessed only a shadow of their once potent martial prowess. Great Imperial cities like Nuln and Mortheim became islands in a sea of Skaven-ruled territory. Eventually, they were all sure to fall. From behind their walls, the Empire's few remaining leaders were sure they were watching the terrible end of Sigmar's great dream of human unity. Yet, hope came from the north. The Elector Count of Middenland and Middenheim, Graf Mundred von Selt, broke the Skaven siege of Middenheim and, gathering what forces he could, fought them to a standstill along the lines of the Talabek and Reich rivers. For the next 9 years, Mundred rallied the Empire's people, and in battle after battle, pushed the Rat men back into their subterranean realm. Finally, in 1124 IC, at the Battle of Averheim, Mundred broke the Skaven armies and sent them fleeing in terror. There, on the battlefield strewn with Skaven corpses, the remaining Elector Counts declared him, by acclamation, Emperor Mundred the First, Skaven Slayer. Emperor Mundred faced a Herculean task of reconstruction. Thanks to the plagues and other depredations caused by the Skaven, it is believed that only roughly 3 out of every 10 souls once living in the Empire had survived the Skaven Wars. Vast tracts of land were laid to waste, and much of the Empire's territory had reverted to wilderness. Mundred's first act upon coming to the throne was to enact punishment for all the foolishness that had led to the disaster. By Imperial decree, he stripped the House of Hohenbach of all of its honors and declared the Grand Province of Drakvald dissolved. Its lands merged with Middenland and Nordland. Its Elector Count's runefang was placed into the vaults of the Cathedral of Ulrich in Middenheim. Emperor Mundred I ruled for over 25 years, and in that time gained a reputation for his strength and as a stern but just ruler. Reconstruction began on the Empire's cities and towns, but much knowledge was lost in the Skaven War that could never be recovered. Mundred ruled as a strong emperor, and the Elector Counts deferred to his wishes in all things. After a few years, the people of the Empire began to forget the horrors of the Skaven Wars during the years of 1115 to 1124 IC, and have even forgotten that the Skaven even exist. But the Skaven never forgot. Taking their revenge, the Skavens of Clan Eshin assassinated Emperor Mundred in his bedchamber on the night of Geheimnisnacht Eve 1152 IC, leaving over a dozen daggers in his body and carving out his heart. Like Sigmar before him, Mundred's Skaven Slayer had left no heirs. The Electoral Council chose a weakling as the next emperor, Emperor Otto of Soland, a pattern that would hold for centuries. The office of the emperor had become a toy to be traded amongst the Elector Counts. It did not matter to them, because they wanted the freedom provided by a weak emperor to engage in their internecine wars without restraint. So common were these that this era has become known in Imperial history as the Age of Wars. Yet the Imperial throne remained an important symbol of human unity, until finally, one Elector Count decided she did not wish to see it in the hands of another. The Age of the Three Emperors, from 1359 to 2000 IC. In 1359 IC, the Grand Duke of Stirland was elected Emperor in Nome, but Grand Duchess Ottilia I of Talabakland felt that the imperial crown was hers by right. In 1360 IC, she declared herself Empress without an election and banned the cult of Sigmar from Talabakland, in retaliation for the Stirlander Emperor's taxes on the cult of Ulrich. From this point forward, the private wars of the Empire took on a religious character, with Sigmarite loyal provinces clashing with Ulrican ones as the two imperial thrones contested for power. Although it was not uncommon for other provinces to side with their ostensible religious enemies for short-term political or strategic gain. This growing religious militancy of the Empire became more clear with the start of the Great Crusades in 1450 IC. Though the majority of the Imperial knightly orders are sworn to the protection of the Empire's people, there are still times when they have found themselves called to war in foreign lands. When Sultan Jafar of the Desert Kingdoms of Araby invaded the distant lands of Estalia, the then current Royarch of Britannia, King Louis the Righteous, raised a grand army of knights and pledged himself to free the distant land from the oppressing clutches of the Arabians. The Bretonnian king issued a call to arms to all warriors of honor in the old world, and the Grand Masters of many imperial knightly orders swore themselves and their knights to this noble cause, seeking to prove their valor in wars beyond the petty civil conflicts that afflicted the Empire during the Age of Wars. During the Bloody Crusade, not only was Estalia freed from the control of Araby, but the gathered knights took the conflict to Araby itself to destroy the Sultan's empire. The knights were filled with religious zeal, and they destroyed the Sultan's decadent palaces, burned thousands of heathen tomes in his grand libraries of ancient lore, and cast down the idols from his temples. The political situation of the empire grew worse in 1547 IC. When the Ulrican Elector Count of Middenland, Grand Duke Heinrich, felt that he had the votes to become emperor by election and unify the empire once again. The other Elector Counts disagreed and made their feelings quite clear by aiming the points of their crossbow quarrels at the Grand Duke's chest. Heinrich stormed off in a rage back to Middenheim and issued a proclamation declaring himself emperor, minting coins and issuing edicts to that effect. Now, the empire had 3 emperors, 1 elected and 2 self-chosen, and the political disintegration only accelerated. The Age of the 3 Emperors had begun. Emperor Heinrich declared war on Frederick V, the Ottilian Emperor, based in Talabheim. Meanwhile, Frederick made war on the Nuln Emperor, whose name has been lost to history, but who was apparently a political tool of the Grand Theogenes of Sigmar. Even the lesser imperial provinces asserted their autonomy in the general chaos. Western Middenland in 1550 IC declared its independence from Middenheim under the leadership of the von Bildhofen family and received the Runefang of Drakvald in return for supporting the claim of the Nuln Emperor. Although no clear record exists of how this magical rune sword disappeared from the Ulrican vaults in Middenheim and appeared in Nuln, the religious lore of the cult of Ranald refers to this theft as the Great Caper. The county of Sylvania gained its independence from Sturland in the chaotic aftermath of the Night of the Restless Dead in 1681 IC, while the towns of Ostermark rebelled against Talabakland with the help of the Ostland Grand Princes, forming the League of Ostermark in 1905 IC. Outside invasion played a role in the political reshaping of the empire as well, with the destruction of Solland and its absorption by Visenland in the wake of Gorbad Ironclaw and his Orc invasion of the empire in 1707 IC. Gorbad Ironclaw was one of the most feared Orc warlords of this era, and he eventually commanded a huge horde of orcs and goblins through Blackfire Pass to devastate the imperial provinces of Avaland and Solland. Eldred, the Elector Count of Solland, marched his forces to the Ava River, where he commanded the crossing towards the province capital of Averheim. Gorbad's army plunged into the river and attacked the imperial defenders on the opposite bank. Though the Greenskin horde lost thousands of warriors during the crossing, the orcs gained a foothold on the other side of the river bank and stormed the imperial forces head-on. This marked a grave turn of events for the defenders, whose only hope for victory had been to keep the orcs on the far bank. The Imperial army could not contain all the beachheads and were soon encircled, and Eldred desperately sought to quit the field before his forces were slaughtered. But this decision came too late, for Orc cavalry had already attacked the halfling province of the Moot and had circled around behind the Imperial army. Eldred's personal bodyguard tried to protect their lord, but goblin wolf riders and orcs on their powerful war boars flanked the Imperial army and ultimately caused a rout. Throwing caution to the wind, Eldred bravely led his great swords to face the leader of the orcs. But Gorbad was a monstrously powerful orc, and even armed with a magical runefang, Eldred was brutally slain. The last Elector Count of Solon's body was dismembered and hung upon the orc warlord's trophy racks. Gorbad took Eldred's runefang and his committal crown as spoils of war. This battle became known as the Battle of Solon's Crown. Gorbad's invasion was only ultimately defeated at the Siege of Altdorf, though not before the Emperor Sigismund was torn apart by a wyvern, and his army was scattered as winter set in. The greenskin threat to the Empire had ended, but the province of Solland was utterly destroyed, and one of the runefangs was lost. Solland was annexed in its entirety by Visenland. Centuries later, The lost rune fang, originally forged by Alaric the Mad, was rediscovered by a warrior band led by the dwarf Thane Urgrim Stonehammer, deep in the lair of a mutant beast in the World's Edge Mountains. Stonehammer returned the rune fang to the Prince of Altdorf, where the sword was placed in the Imperial treasury, to be presented to the greatest of Imperial heroes and wielded in battle in the times of direst need. Before the peers of the Empire would accede to the annexation of Solland by Visenland, the other Elector Counts demanded the political separation of the city of Nuln from Visenland. Talabheim, too, gained a short-lived independence from Talabakland when the Talabaklander Emperor Horst the Cautious refused to attack an invading army in 1750 IC, leading the city to revolt and embrace its own emperor, Helmut II. The political collapse of the empire was complete with the election of Grand Countess Margarita of Nuln in 1979 IC via a rump council of electors. None outside of Visenland, Sturland and Avaland recognized her rule, and the Grand Theogenist declared the office of Emperor vacant. For almost 400 years, the Empire was nothing more than a fading idea of unity in men's minds. One other event heralded the dark times that were about to engulf the Empire: the destruction of the city of Mordheim. Once the greatest city and capital of the League of Ostermark. Corruption and madness ran riot within the walls of Mordheim as the second Millennium IC drew to a close. A twin-tailed comet appeared in the sky above Mordheim on the first day of the year 1999 IC, growing ever closer as the final day of the Millennium approached. A depraved festival atmosphere grew in the city, and it is said that demons crept from the shadows, crying with joy and carousing with men and women alike. As the clock struck midnight, the comet, a great mass of green warpstone, smashed down on the city like a divine hammer. The people of the Empire came to believe that Sigma had judged Mordheim lacking. Those unfortunate people who survived the impact were soon horribly mutated by exposure to such high concentrations of warpstone, and, to make matters worse, the Skaven were drawn to the city in large numbers by such massive concentrations of the chaotic substance. Mordheim had become the city of the damned, cursed forever to be a place of ill fortune and misery until its eventual destruction at the hands of the Sigmarite forces of the Grand Theogenist and a combined force of the Imperial Knightly Orders. Yet even today, the Skaven-haunted ruins of Mordheim are a byword for sin and moral corruption.